Okie doke.
Hello and welcome to And Did Those Feet, the podcast that looks at and explores the world of English football between 1945 and 1970. And joining me as ever, Carl Hemsley. Hello, Carl.
Hello, Peter.
So normally, Carl, we talk about what happened in the world of English football in those 25 golden years. But today we're going to talk about what didn't happen with a series
Mm,
of what ifs. And the idea really is if, for example, that let's suppose that Duncan Edwards had survived the Munich air crash, what if he'd continued to play up until and through 1966? Would he have been England captain in at Wembley in the 66 World Cup? So that's the kind of question we're going to ask, and we're going to begin with
yes.
a question from the early years of 1945 and thereafter, which is England's application to rejoin FIFA in
Yes.
1945. And what's the story here, Carl? What's the background?
So it was after the Second World War that the four home nations rejoined FIFA, having left between the wars over some silly argument about amateurism. And um, all four were members of FIFA, and of course that meant they competed with as four separate nations in the World Cup, of course. And we're perfectly used to that being the case. But in a sense, FIFA were kind of breaking their own rules by accepting that arrangement. And so my what if is, what if FIFA had said, well, you can join, but you've got to join as the UK. And of course, to us, that this seems a strange notion, except that, of course, there is a competition where we do compete as the UK, and that's the Olympics. And so it's not beyond the realms, I think, that that could have happened. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland would have kept their own FAs. They could have kept having the home international championships and playing what we would now term friendlies against other countries, but would have entered this still relatively new competition, the World Cup, as the UK, as they did with the Olympics. And maybe for the first two or three times that this happened, the World Cup might not have been that big a deal to the UK. But perhaps by 1958, the third time they were there, a Britain side, I think, would have been considerably stronger than an England side.
It would.
The keeper would have been either Greg or Kelsey, Northern Ireland and Wales, respectively. Northern Ireland would also have provided Blanchflower, McHarland. Wales was provided maybe Cliff Jones, who'd just gone for a record transfer fee, and definitely would have provided John Charles. So the contribution from those countries would have made a UK side, I think, a lot stronger than an England side.
No, I think you're right.
And maybe that would have created a bigger interest in the World Cup. They would have competed better. By 1962, I actually think there was a side that would have been a real contender, because by that time, Bobby Moore had got in. You'd have a central midfield like Blanchflower and Mackay as played for Spurs. Law and Greaves together up front. Cliff Jones of Wales, he was in his pomp. Henderson playing on the opposite wing from Scotland. You can imagine a really strong side. And my contention, I think, is that, yeah, of course, well, England won the World Cup in 66, of course. But I think a UK side over the years would have been a serious contender far more often. And I'm going to say it, I think would have won more than the one World Cup that England has won.
I think you're right about that. I think we would have qualified in the 1970s as well with all those fantastic Scottish players who would have been part of the mix. How popular it would have been in different parts of the UK is difficult. And I'm not sure that Northern Ireland would have, shouldn't Northern Ireland actually really be with the Republic of Ireland? But one curious thing I would like to mention on this is what, to draw your attention, is this very odd match in 1947 when Great Britain played the rest of Europe. And this was apparently to celebrate Britain's or the local FAs, the home FAs, accession to FIFA. And the game was played at Hampden. Great Britain won 6 goals to 1, and the fees, the money that was raised through this game, which was 35,000 quid, was the money that was made from the game, was given to FIFA. Now, I don't know, but I think that, I mean, that seems to me quite suspicious. I don't know if there's anything behind that, quite what that was about, but it seems to me that in football, as in life, very, very rarely does money change hands as a gift. So I can't help feeling there was some quid pro quo there. And I wonder if the idea was that FIFA was absolutely broke. They weren't going to negotiate with England, Scotland, and Wales unless there was a good reason to do so. And 35,000 good reasons were put their way in. I mean, I'm guessing, I'm speculating, but it's a very odd match, it seems to me. And if you think that England at that time, or UK, I should say, at that time, was pretty broke, really had no money at all, the idea of giving 35,000 quid to FIFA, it seems to be a very odd decision.
Yeah,
Now,
I hadn't realised that. I definitely think you're onto something there.
it's a very odd. Now, of course, England then are told that they take part in the taking part in the World Cup, of course, and that means 1950. And as everybody knows, 1950 was a disastrous World Cup for England's point of view. Absolutely embarrassing. The whole of the 1950s were pretty embarrassing, but they get off on a terrible foot with the defeat in Brazil to the United States. We don't normally expect the United States to beat England at football, but it did do in this occasion. And I want to try and identify one of the reasons for that and what perhaps was one of the what ifs that arise from it. And it's this. It seems to me that England in 1945 to 50 have a pretty strong first team. They've got
Yes.
two great wingers in Matthews and Finney, a lot of very good centre forwards in people like Lofthouse, Mortensen, Jackie Milburn, some good inside forwards like Mannion, some good defensive players like Dickinson and Billy Wright, and I think a pretty good goalkeeper in Williams, and a good reserve in Ditchburn for that matter. But what that team lacks in particular is a centre half, and there's a reason why it's lacking a centre half, and that's because he is basically defaulted. His name is Neil Franklin, as we know, and he was really one of the best players that England had in the years between 1945 and 1950. For example, they played 27 internationals in that period, and Neil Franklin plays in all 27. He's undroppable, even though there are 8 selectors and they're mavericks and they can't be trusted. Nevertheless, Neil Franklin, there are 2 that play every game. Neil Franklin is one, Billy Wright is the other. And Billy Wright goes on to win 105 caps. That's how good Neil Franklin was. Now, about a month or 2 before England go to Brazil in 1950, this pivot, don't forget, the centre half is the heart of the team. This pivot around whom the team has been built suddenly defaults and heads off to Colombia to play for a pirate football league and to make some decent money. That's the aim anyway. It doesn't actually happen, but that's what the aim is. And I think the heart of the England team is kind of ripped out by this defection. What's more, I think because of the way that the English treat these things, the English tend, once you get a sort of traitor in the midst, it's not, I hope I'm not overstating this, the English he tends to not be sort of, his name is not mentioned again. And I think one of the reasons why we never really got to the bottom of the 1950 World Cup disaster, losing to the United States out in the first round, out before the end of the group stages, is because the cause of it was Neil Franklin. And people really, I think, in the early 1950s, really wanted to forget that Neil Franklin even existed. Now, one of the curious things about him, so he played 27 games for England, all 27 of the post-war games. And I just thought to myself, I'd like to know who played when Neil Franklin had left the fold. Who played in the next 27 games? And here's the answer. Bill Jones of Liverpool played 2 of them. Lawrence Hughes of Liverpool played 3. Allenby Chilton of Man United played 2. Leslie Compton, the cricketer of Arsenal, played 2. Jack Froggatt played 9. Jack Froggatt of Portsmouth played 9 games. James Taylor of Fulham, not really a name that's come down to us, 2 caps. Malcolm Barras, Bolton, 3 caps. Harry Johnson, Blackpool, 4 caps. There were 8 who played the second 27 games of England's post-war
That's
sequence of matches. And there's no doubt at all in my mind that the big hole in the England team, I mean, one particular sports journalist said that England had lost their anchor and would soon be all at sea. And in nowhere were they more at sea than in the centre half position vacated by Neil Franklin. So my what if is, had Neil Franklin stayed on board, would England have put up a better show in that World Cup? And I think the answer is, I think they would have reached the final stages, the group, the
yes.
final, the last four. Let's put it like that, which was there were four groups, and the winner of each group got out of the group and went into the final pool, along with Brazil, Uruguay, and a team led by George Rayner, an Englishman, and that was Sweden. And I think England would have joined those four. And after that, who knows what might have happened. So
That's a very interesting one. I think you're right. I think the United States game was a freak one anyway. So if you change anything, it probably leads to England winning. But especially if it's Franklin, who I agree with you is as important as you've said. Maybe if England had got through to that final group, it would have created more interest back home. And if, as I suspect might still have happened even with Franklin, we'd got little change out of Brazil and Uruguay, that might have been a bit of a wake-up call because they wouldn't have been freak losses to Brazil and Uruguay that were very good sides. And that might have led to England maybe realising they had a bit of catching up to do. And if Franklin had still been around, they would have been in a better position to do that catching up. Because I think you're right about how good and important a player he was.
And also how there was no replacement for him. I mean, sometimes you can lose a player and it's fine. Because, like Mortensen, for example, after 1953, come to 1953 in a moment, Mortensen is dropped after 53, but it's basically all right because Lofthouse can replace him. Well, with Neil Franklin, there was no one to replace him. He was irreplaceable. And the fact that 8 players played in the next 27 games after he'd played in the first 27 tells the same story. Let's cut to 1953 and the sequence of events that runs up to the demolition of England's home record of being undefeated at Wembley from against continental opposition. And it's an extraordinary story, really. So Hungary is due to play at Wembley in 1953, November 1953, and they're the best team on the planet. They're unbeaten for 22 games. And it so happens, by coincidence, that their last game before they come to Wembley is going to be against Sweden. And they play Sweden and they draw 2-2. And Hungary a little bit lucky, perhaps, to get a draw there, to preserve their unbeaten record, because it is said that Sweden hit the bar in the last 2 minutes. And certainly Sweden appear to have, been absolutely competitive in the game. After the game, Sweden's manager, George Rayner, I think fair to say a friend of the show, because we're great admirers of George Rayner, even though nobody's ever heard of him. But George Rayner, who's the Swedish manager, who's an Englishman, he happens to run into Walter Winterbottom, the England manager, who, of course, they're now a week away. This is actually, it's 8 days between the game between Sweden and Hungary and the game with England and Hungary. And George Rayner happens to run into Walter Winterbottom. And he says, if you're going to beat them, you've got to do one thing, and that is you've got to man mark Hidekuti. He's their centre forward, but he doesn't play in the traditional role of an English number 9. He actually plays really from the centre circle on. And what that means is that they've got 4 attackers to your 3 defenders, and they've got an extra man in midfield. And you've somehow got to, I would say, man mark him, much in the way, I think, that Nobby Stiles was deputed to man mark Eusebio in the 1966 World Cup. I mean, it seems to me, that's how it is. Anyway, Walter Winterbottom is given this very solid advice by George Rayner, but he doesn't take it. And 1 minute into the game, in fact, 45 seconds into the game, Hidekuti picks up the ball 40 yards from goal. He dummies the England defence, who obligingly get out of the way. He moves into the penalty area and then smacks the ball past the England goalkeeper, Merrick, for Hungary 1, England 0 after 45 seconds. At half-time, it's 4-2. And by 10 minutes into the second half, it's 6-2 and the game is over. So I would say that 2 things that arise from this, from my point of view. One is that I think if England had taken we could say, what if? We could even say if only England had taken the advice that George Rayner gave Walter Winterbottom, then England's record against continental opposition would perhaps have been preserved. But I want to add another point about this, and that's this. It seems to me that English football actually benefited hugely from the defeat to Hungary in 1953, they weren't just losers from it, they benefited too. Because what it did was it kind of liberated a lot of radical thinkers about football, people like Ron Greenwood, Malcolm Allison, Bobby Robson, Don Howe, all of whom were famously present at the game and watched the game. Don Revie, another one.
Yeah.
Many, many big names in English management and English tactical football history and football thinking were there. And I think it was probably, I think if we're going to ask, you know, how do we feel about that result? Of course, you know, deeply disappointing, etc. But actually, I think it was pretty good for England that they lost that game. It blew away an
Yes,
awful lot of cobwebs. And I don't know that England would have won the World Cup in '66 if they hadn't been really, you know, soundly beaten in '53.
yes. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it did provide the wake-up call that England needed. Tactically, you're right. I mean, man marking Hizakuti was definitely would have been the right thing to do. I still suspect that Hungarian side was in a different league than England, and they'd have beaten us in a slightly different way. They were just too good. But undoubtedly, it does show just how rigid the English tactics were. But you're right. The fact that England got the pasting that they did ultimately was probably a good thing.
It's very telling, it seems to me. We're doing what ifs. What if Winterbottom had listened? I mean, I quite admire Walter Winterbottom. What if Walter Winterbottom had actually listened to George Rayner in 1953?
Mm.
And it seems to me it's very typical. I mean, actually, Walter Winterbottom wasn't a typical English football figure, but I mean, he was more flexible than that and more free thinking, I think. But at the same time, it's somehow very typical of English football that at that time, especially, that they seemed to know better. They didn't need to listen. They had no lessons to learn, and it was only when it was unarguable what had happened, what the lesson that they had to learn, that they learned their lessons, and Alf Ramsey did the rest. We're going to talk about Alf Ramsey later, aren't we? But you're going to talk first about
the Munich air disaster.
Munich Air, okay, 1958.
And what if that disaster had not occurred?
Yeah.
So I probably should declare an interest by saying I'm a Manchester United supporter, so I'm very biased.
Yes.
But I don't think there's much doubt that at that time it was the United had the best team in English football, and it was a very young side that overall was improving. They were a little bit behind Wolves in the league that season, and if you posit a what if, which was maybe that they delayed their journey back to England, that might have made it more likely that they would have lost the game that they were playing that weekend to Wolves, because they were arriving back in England late, and maybe Wolves would have still won the league that year. But I think it would have been a case of United retaining the league the following year, going back into Europe, a slightly older, more experienced side. And by 1960, when the European Cup final was held at Hampden, we remember that final as being a fantastic final with Real Madrid beating Eintracht Frankfurt. But Real Madrid didn't actually win the league, their own league that year.
Mm.
And it seems an odd thing to say about such a famous game in which they played so well. But Real Madrid was starting to get that little bit older.
Yeah.
And a game at Hampden, maybe that final, if it had been in the final when United had played Real, could have been the point when United won the European Cup then, rather than 8 years later. And also that maybe they would have then gone on to win another European Cup or two, and to have won the league 2 years out of 3 over a period of time, somewhat like Liverpool in the 70s and 80s and United themselves from the 1990s into this century. So perhaps, I hate to say it, Peter, to you, but Spurs maybe would not have won their double in 61, and rather than it being an era where there were several successful sides, maybe United would have been a dominant force in that period, in much the same way as they were much later on under Ferguson. Having said that, undoubtedly, for all that it was a terrible human tragedy, what Munich did was play an enormous part in United becoming a massive club worldwide. And if that had not happened, then yes, they would have been a club who had a period of dominance from the late 50s into the 60s. But maybe there would just have been one other such club that had a dominant period. And without Munich, maybe they wouldn't have been quite the supersized club that they became.
You might be right. I think the team would have been incredibly strong because even at Munich, even at 58, 57 even, the team is beginning to develop a real strength in depth. For example, the left wing position, Albert Scanlon, I think I'm right in saying, by the time of the Munich air crash, is a first-class player. But he's being pushed for his place in the team by Bobby Charlton. And the number of players who were really, I mean, they had a squad of 16 or something. And quite apart from the fact that they had some I mean, Duncan Edwards is obviously a generational talent, but players like Roger Byrne and Tommy Taylor were huge figures. And the fact that United were continuing to bring players through, and where does Bobby Charlton fit into a team which has got somebody like that, somebody like Tommy Taylor at centre forward? You know, so the wealth of their recruitment was so fantastic, and of their youth process. So, you know, and bear in mind that George Best is really, you know, about to join this. I think that they could well have dominated Europe in the 1960s. I mean, I say that in a completely neutral way. I do, of course, regret that those players who would have lit up the 1958 World Cup, Roger Byrne, Duncan Edwards, and Tommy Taylor, but also Bobby Charlton. Bobby Charlton didn't play in the 58 World Cup, as you know, because it was felt it was too much for him because he'd been through the Munich air crash. But he would have played. That's four players. We could have done something in 58. Another what if?
And in 62, people like, Eddie Coleman would have been around about 25, 26. As just as a for instance, and that was a Winter World Cup admittedly in South America, but again, they would have made England so much stronger, not just in 58, but arguably even more so in 62.
No, I think that's right. I think throughout the 60s, I mean, I think they would have been a power in the land. It's a great tragedy. Let's move on to 66 and the what if around Jeff Hurst, who famously was also a talented cricketer and could well have. He played for Essex in the county championship. Now he didn't have a very distinguished time, as we know, because he played one game and he didn't get a wicket, he didn't get a catch, and didn't get a run. But nevertheless, he was good enough to play for Essex in county cricket. And if he'd chosen, as I think, you know, one might forgive him for doing so, to become a county cricketer rather than a first-class footballer, of course, he could have done both. And in a way, he did do both. But let's suppose that he became a county cricketer and 1966 simply didn't happen. On that fabled July afternoon when England were winning the World Cup and Jeff Hurst was writing his name into the history books, he could equally have been fielding at mid-off for Essex against Hampshire at Chelmsford. That could easily have been his fate. So it would have been. So in that case, one asks the question, who would have played instead of him? And of course, the obvious answer is Jimmy Greaves. But let's just assume that, first of all, that Ramsey is looking for a like for like, and Jeff Hurst and Jimmy Greaves are not like for like. They are very different footballers. And let's also assume that Jimmy Greaves isn't fit enough. So we don't quite know how fit Jimmy Greaves was on that occasion. But let's just assume who were the other replacements. Well, one of the curious things I think about the England 22 for the 66 World Cup is that actually there isn't really a like for like replacement in Jeff Hurst in that squad. And I think the nearest I can see there is perhaps George Eastham, but he's not like, he's a scheming inside forward. He's not a target man and, and a centre forward as Jeff Hurst was. So I thought, I thought, been interesting. Okay, so let's have a what if on this. Let's suppose Jeff Hurst is a county cricketer, and let's suppose that Ramsey is going to try and pick somebody off his type. Who's he going to pick? So I've come up here with 12 possible alternatives who might have got the gig instead of in replacing Jeff Hurst. Budgie Byrne, John Budgie Byrne of West Ham, no less, had a very
Yes.
good claim. He had 8 goals in 11 internationals, including a hat-trick away to Portugal. I mean, that's some achievement, bear in mind how good Portugal were. And 17 goals over the season, over the course of the season. Jeff Hurst had about double that, but nevertheless, Budgie Byrne, I think, was a genuine, had a genuine claim on this. I'm going to give 5, and the last one is going to be the one I'm going to choose. So I'm not accepting necessarily Budgie Byrne. Fred Pickering of Everton had 3 caps with 5 goals to his name. I mean, a pretty good rate, including a hat-trick against the USA, which must have been pleasant for Alf Ramsey after what happened in 1950. Very prolific goal scorer, 59 goals in 123 games for Blackburn, and 56 in 97 for Everton. So Fred Pickering knows how to hit the back of the net. Mick Jones of Sheffield United capped twice for England in 65. He's a centre forward. He's a genuine centre forward. And so we got a real like-for-like replacement there in Mick Jones. And Tony Hateley would have been a pretty good option too, with a lot of goals for Aston Villa, including 4 second-half goals against Spurs in March 66 and 27 goals in 65-66. So 27 goals over the course of the season. He's obviously pretty good.
He was in form.
But the name I'm going to go with is Joe Baker, who scores 112, 110, 102 goals for Hibernian of Edinburgh, 100 goals for Arsenal, has 8 England caps and scores 3 goals. And in particular, he gets a goal in the epochal 2-0 victory over Spain in 1965, where Ramsey evidently discovered the team he wanted to play. The centre forward there was Joe Baker. Now, the curious thing with Joe Baker is that he only played for England. He was fit. He was qualified for England, but he was only qualified for England because he was born in England. He was Scottish in every other respect. He was brought up in Scotland. His mum was Scottish.
Yes.
He played all his football for Scotland apart from his Arsenal sojourn. But he was England qualified. He did play for England, and he is the most typical, I think, the most sort of like for like, if you like, with Jeff Hurst that I can come across. So I think my what if Jeff Hurst had taken it up county cricket and was playing for Essex on the afternoon in question, I think the actual best replacement for him would have been Joe Baker, the Scotsman, and he was only qualified for England. And I don't know how that would have changed how we look at that World Cup triumph, but in retrospect. But
that is an interesting one because of the people that you were saying. I must admit, I was thinking Budgie Byrne until you made that point about the game in Spain, which I think was very, very influential in the way that Ramsey.
Yes, it was. Yeah, absolutely.
It was also he hit upon a tactic that he then shelved.
100%.
Or rather, kept up his sleeve is a better way of putting it.
Exactly what he did
until the tournament. And the fact that it was Baker in that game, I think, means that you're very, very probably correct in saying it would have been him.
Over to you, last one.
Okay, so I'm going to be very controversial with this one, and my what if is also concerning the 1966 World Cup. What would have happened if the Argentinian captain, Ratin, had not been sent off in the quarter-final against England at Wembley? An incident which I think it's quite difficult to overstate how much the Argentinians felt about this and how much wrong they'd been done. That a German referee sent him off, admitting he could speak no Spanish, but saying in an interview the day after the game, the look on his face was enough. Now, had Ratin stayed on the pitch, I think England really had their work cut out in that game. They had their work cut out when he was sent off, because the game only finished 1-0 for England, and it took them past the 70th minute before they scored. And I'm going to posit a controversial what if that that game would have been incredibly tight, would have gone to extra time, and unpatriotically say Argentina would have nicked it. What would have happened then? Well, as far as the World Cup's concerned, there's another slightly controversial thing that happened in the World Cup, which was that England played their semi-final after beating Argentina at Wembley, even though there'd been the FA had published a magazine before the World Cup showing that the winner of that quarter-final would play its semi-final at Goodison. And a rules committee sort of met and decided that the game should have been played at Wembley because it would get a better crowd. Now, I suspect that if Argentina had won, they would have played their semi-final. That semi-final would still have been played at Goodison against Portugal. So Germany probably would still have beaten Russia, the Soviet Union, sorry. That game would have been at Wembley. There'd have been a semi-final between Portugal and Argentina at Goodison. Portugal were used to playing at Goodison. They'd had that great comeback win against North Korea. They wouldn't have needed to travel to London. Argentina would have had their very tough game at Wembley with England. There was no Nobby Stiles to mark Eusebio out of the game. So I'm going to say probably Portugal would have beaten Argentina. Final at Wembley, Portugal against Germany. Maybe not much to choose between them. Could have come down to whether Eusebio or Beckenbauer had the bigger influence on the game. But again, I think arguably Portugal probably had a better side than Germany at that point. I think the Portuguese would have won the World Cup. So the boys of 66 would have been Portugal. England would not have won their own World Cup. And English football would have been pretty despondent. They would have wanted a new coach. They probably would have gone for somebody who they would have seen as unlike Ramsey, at least tactically speaking. That's the way England tend to go, shift from one extreme to the other. So I don't know who they would have got, of course, but I'm going to throw out there maybe the manager of a very attacking side with wingers, and maybe they would have gone for Ramsey's old foe, Bill Nicholson.
Well, I was going to suggest Bill Nicholson, actually, because he's got a... Whether he'd have taken it, I don't know if he'd have taken it, because he was very well set up at Tottenham.
Yeah.
But he is an obvious choice because he's continuing to win trophies, and it's yeah.
He would have been. I think he would have been the choice that England, the FA would have wanted more than anybody else. Catterick would have been a possibility,
yes,
as well.
Joe Mercer.
There'd be Mercer possibly, although City hadn't quite got into the.
I think they were in the second division, actually.
Yeah. Again, Revy a little bit early.
Yes.
But would Nicholson's free-flowing attacking football have worked well at international football? I'm not sure that it would have done. And maybe again we've got a scenario where England would have swayed between one type of manager and another, and not quite hit the winning formula. So yes, controversial one out there, where in a what if in which England don't win the 66th World Cup because Ratton had stayed on the pitch.
No, it's an intriguing thought, and of course it is a reminder that most triumphs in tournaments are the result of a bit of luck here, hit the post there, dodgy refereeing decision here and there, and it is always a matter of what ifs, and I think there's every reason for us to explore what ifs again at some future date. So those were the what ifs of the 1945 to 70 sequence, and we look forward to another go at this another time. So that's all for us for now, and it's goodbye to Carl.
And bye. See you, Peter.
Bye bye.